Hello and welcome to Conversations with Non-Catholic Christians. Today I am very excited to be joined by Pierce. Pierce, what's going on? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, yeah, nothing much. I'm just sitting here, been studying all day, and now I'm ready to talk. Yeah, I'm Pierce, philosopher of science. Um, I have a master's in philosophy. My PhD is indefinitely on hold right now, so we'll see. And then, I don't know, philosophical background. I was trained mostly in analytics, and then in the last like 5, 6 years, I have branched out into ancient and kind of integrating ancient philosophy of science with more modern analytic philosophy. So I do stuff like that that obviously has overlap into philosophy of science generally, but it also ends up bleeding into philosophy of religion a lot, um, things like that. Yeah.
Cool. And what's your religious background? So I have you on the I just wrote Eastern Orthodox. But maybe you want to just spend like 30 seconds kind of giving us your religious background too.
Yeah, so I am currently Eastern Orthodox. I converted in 20 I started the process of converting in 2018, but it took a while. But I was born into a Catholic family, raised Catholic until I was about 10, baptized and everything. But then, because of the sex abuse scandals in the 90s, my family left the Catholic Church and
Mm.
became evangelical Protestants. And we're in pretty fairly hardcore fundamentalist evangelical groups that I was then raised in for all of my teen years. Um, and Yeah, I became agnostic during that time because I didn't want to be evangelical. And then it was, late teenage years that I um, became a Christian again, but never really had a church home, never really knew what denomination I fit into until much later, until I was, 24, 25, when I became Orthodox. Yeah.
Okay. And the kind of Catholic family that you were born into, was it more of like your typical Catholic family? And when I say typical, I mean like, mass and English kind of deal. Like you weren't born into a trad family necessarily.
Yeah, I definitely wasn't born to a trad
Okay.
family. My experience with like trads and fundamentalism is all from the Protestant sphere. The Catholic church we went to was way more progressive and definitely in English. Although we did, my family, like half my family's like Italian on my mom's side, so a lot of cultural Catholics there. But my grandmother and my mother, when I was young, were very into going to Latin masses when they're available. I grew up like right down the street from a monastery,
Oh, wow.
so we would go there sometimes just for like maybe the prayer services or a liturgy, or I guess you call it mass, right? But you know, that sort of thing. So I was exposed to that, but definitely no real trad leanings there until
Okay.
they became evangelical. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, that's kind of funny. Your brushes with the trad side of things has not been Catholic. It was Protestant. And now as Eastern Orthodox, I guess the Eastern Orthodox kind of never lost their whole trad leaning, like in general. Like they didn't
Yeah.
have a Vatican II. So
Right,
okay.
exactly. Yeah, and especially American Orthodoxy right now, like that's becoming a bigger and bigger problem. Is a sort of hardcore. I don't know what we call them, ortho bros and stuff like that. Right.
Yeah, it's funny. Sometimes like the ortho bros and the rad trads online, I should say, are like you almost can't tell them apart until they tell you which side they're on,
Right.
unless
Yeah.
they're going on about like one particular saint or something. If they're going on and on about Pope Pius XII, like okay, so they're Catholic,
Yeah.
and if they're going on and on about one of the early patriarchs, okay, maybe they're more Orthodox, but otherwise, sometimes it's hard to tell them apart.
I could rant about that for hours. I mean, I really think they are essentially have most of the core same values, and I think that the ortho bros really fit in better into Catholicism than they do Eastern Orthodoxy, in my opinion.
Really?
Um, yeah, they don't necessarily like the Pope, but they really would like Eastern Orthodoxy to be a more hierarchically defined, doctrinally defined, and dogmatic set of institutions than it is.
So in a way, they're almost jealous of like the potential hierarchy of the church. It's just that they look at the hierarchy of the church and they think like, well, I don't want that, but I want like a more kind of orthodox and conservative version of what the Catholics have.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And the big thing, one of the big Catholic apologist talking points, I really like Michael Lofton at Reason and Theology.
Yeah, he's a good guy.
One of his arguments against Eastern Orthodoxy is like, it's so hard to nail down a dogmatic debate settling position on things. And a lot of the Ortho bros online think that's like, well, he's right. We should really get our act together and have like essentially an equivalent to the Catholic Catechism, where it's like all of the main issues are answered. A lot of these things are infallibly defined, and it's like, well, but that's not really how Orthodoxy works. I think you might be more comfortable being a Catholic.
That's kind of funny.
If the Pope wasn't there. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that is kind of funny. Yeah. So I have to say, you are the first Eastern Orthodox person that I think I've had like a real conversation with. I've spoken with plenty of culturally Orthodox people. My one brother-in-law is Macedonian Orthodox,
Yeah.
but that's because he was born in Macedonia. And like it's just kind of how, like, they're not particularly religious people. They don't go to church every Sunday. Like they I don't think they could tell you the first thing about dogma per se. They just, they are Macedonians, so they're Macedonian Orthodox. That's just how it is. And really all of my brushes with kind of the Orthodox tradition has been with cultural Orthodox folks, not with like actually religious Orthodox folks. And I don't mean to say this in like a dismissive way towards people who are culturally Orthodox. I just mean those who I have had brushes with have always been culturally only Orthodox.
Yeah.
So, and maybe what I'll have to do too is I'll have to have you on again, and we can kind of do the whole like Ortho Bro thing in like a little bit more detail. But I think that the plan for today, and if you want to take this in a different direction by all means, but I think that the plan for today was to talk about science. And you'll have to forgive me for that interruption there. We were going to talk about the philosophy of science and the philosophy of religion. These are kind of, I guess, big terms. And I know that you've been doing like a lot of, your whole master's was kind of in this field, right? So was there one particular spot that you wanted to get started kind of with regards to philosophy of science and religion? I know we touched on a whole bunch of points over email, but I'm not sure if you had a particular jumping off point in mind.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I think, especially for your channel, a useful way of getting into it is like why I got into philosophy of science, because that was not at all my goal when I started doing philosophy. And it might be a nice picture of like what philosophy of science can actually do to help you in other things. Because philosophy of science might sound narrow, like, well, it deals with like philosophy of physics and philosophy of biology, but how does it really help you generally? And I got into it because I don't know if you know of Richard Swinburne. He's also an Eastern Orthodox philosopher, but he primarily cut his teeth on the 1960s philosophy of science, and what he ended up doing was wrote a series of books where he used the methods that he thought he had kind of a good overall picture of the methods that scientists use in creating and confirming theories, right? And he used those to try to confirm theism, and actually used the Bayesian probability calculus, which is just like a formal logical system for estimating and balancing probabilities, to try to actually get a rough estimate of, given all this evidence that he's going to bring up, given some atheist counter arguments, how likely is theism. And his point there was ultimately that the same methods that science uses are general methods for everything, for every inquiry that's not deductive, that's not like a priori. And I was like 17 when I first came across those books, and it blew my mind because I really didn't have a good grasp on science. I went to a private fundamentalist school where it's like we were learning out of like Bob Jones University textbooks.
Right.
And so it was just like, yeah, the craters on the moon actually show the Earth is 1 year old. Um,
My textbooks said the same thing when I went to my FSSP affiliated Catholic school. Yep.
yeah, yeah. So my science background was awful out of high school, but what I really wanted was I started studying philosophy to because I had profound doubts about the existence of God and things like that. And but when I ran into Richard Swinburne's book, I was like, wait a minute, I can't even. It seems like the best arguments for the existence of God, for or against, have to first kind of have this methodology down, and we have to get to the bottom of like what is scientific methodology, what are explanations, what are theories, how do you confirm them, how do you test them, how do you construct them. And so now it's been almost 13 years where I read those books in my late teen years, and I was like, I'm not going to even finish these books. I'm going to go spend enough time understanding the method first and then come back to the arguments. And what I really found was that the history of science is like such a beautiful example of how human beings reason, that's interwoven with all of these different domains like religion and art and things like that. Um, and by the end of, I would say, like a 10-year period of studying where I went through undergrad and grad school and then was teaching as well for a couple of years at the university level and developing some of the stuff I've worked on, really getting a picture. Like, I guess philosophy of science to me is getting a picture on scientific methodology and how the sciences, what the goal of science is, but also concretely and probably more importantly, like how science is supposed to reach that goal. um, and that gets you into so many different types of discussions that it's just applicable everywhere basically.
Yeah, I'm always like a little bit taken aback when I hear maybe the more pop apologist move, I'll call it, of um well, God is not an empirical notion, so just, kind of put empiricism on the back burner and don't worry about it right now.
Yeah,
Whenever I hear that, my kind of, empirical brain goes like, whoa, 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 slow down. Like, empiricism is kind of like it's the whole kit and caboodle, in some senses. I think it's one of the only games in town, right? If not the only game in town, then it's one of the only ones. And I will argue till I'm blue in the face that our best beliefs are the ones that are grounded in empiricism. And the rationalists will disagree with me on that one, and they'll say that, no, our best beliefs are the ones that we kind of just know a priori. But all of that put to the side, I'm always like a little bit off put when I hear kind of like the whole God's not an empirical notion, so let's just not worry about empiricism. I'm always like, I don't think we should discard empiricism so quickly.
right. No, I completely agree with that. I honestly think when a lot of the pop apologists say that sort of thing, it's a defensive move, it's a retreat, right? um because if you read someone like Thomas Aquinas, who I've read a fair bit of, like, he has a lot of metaphysical speculation, but he's an empiricist in the sense that your metaphysical systems, your metaphysical theories are supposed to explain the facts that we can all agree on, or the facts that are highly, highly probable. And those are basically all going to come from, empirical data,
Yeah.
other than maybe truths of math, truths of logic, things like that. Um, but I mean, for Aquinas and Aristotle, even things, and you've talked about nominalism a lot, like even things like general truths about like category, species, genre, even those are ultimately grounded in the empirical, because you're abstracting away from particular empirical beings that you and their behavior that you see. So, it doesn't seem to be really keeping with like the tradition of even like the most rigorous theologians to just kind of be like, well, let's focus on other things.
Yeah, I agree. I forget exactly where it is in Thomas's corpus of work, but Aquinas does write about a blank slate at one point. Which is kind of funny to think that he was almost like a proto-empiricist in some ways. So
Yeah, no, definitely. And the thing that what I really like about like kind of my method for exploring anything is to do a history of ideas on it. Like I don't so much like doing the analytical process now, like that a lot of Anglo-American analytical philosophers have, which is like read every journal paper written in the last 50 years and then you're an expert on it. I tend to think it's better to like look at a lineage of historical sources and how ideas develop over time. And when you do that, you actually find that like empiricism comes in very many shades, and there's not a huge gulf or gap between rationalism and empiricism in the intermediary steps, I guess. So it's like someone like Thomas is way closer to someone like John Locke than what I would say a bad pop apologist that doesn't really understand philosophy, how they argue, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess as you're thinking about the scientific method in general, I know that the very first kind of bullet point that you sent me as like conversation topics was I'll just go ahead and read it because I think that we've more or less arrived at I think what can be the first bullet point. You say that so for the scientific method in general, there kind of is no such uniform, well-developed method unique to science, but rather it's like a logic of inquiry. And you say that a major influence here was C.S. Pierce.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, okay, yeah, I mean, I can jump into that. So to preface this, um, there are really this a lot of what I'm about to say falls under epistemology, but the difference between me and the people I really like to read and a lot of the contemporary epistemology is like epistemology done when you're doing philosophy of science has a lot more to do with trying to discover and construct what I call the logic of inquiry, which is like the process of scientific investigation, the different logical steps that are involved in it, and then the status of like the conclusions of science, things like that. So it's trying to construct the method of like, oh, this looking at historical sources, this is how scientists actually have reasoned. And here's also the normative question there is like, and here's how we should tweak it to actually have a good normative pattern. A lot of epistemology done not from that angle ends up being a lot like contemporary normative ethics, which is very thought experimenty. And it's like, well, what justify true belief with the Gettier problem? Like, I can make up the situation where you have knowledge or you don't have knowledge, even when you have justified true belief. And you get into all these semantic issues that are just like trying to clarify a concept. But the way I do it and the way someone like C.S. Peirce did it, who was he died in 1913, so he's like a 19th, the very early 20th century American philosopher, the father of pragmatism. Um, he's more trying to take a broad look and look at like how science actually proceeds as a process, not as just invoking certain concepts like knowledge or things like that. So in short, what I mainly focus on in philosophy of science is that process. And C.S. Peirce, though he's like probably the most influential philosopher of the 20th century, um, he really a lot of his work was not published in his lifetime, and it only comes in fragments. And it's only over the last like 50 years that people have really started assembling it. But he gave a really, really powerful model of scientific inquiry that's called the three-step process of scientific inquiry. And he thought that basically this is how human beings know pretty much anything other than a priori truths, like logic and math. But he coined the term abduction, which if you actually read Peirce ends up being something like the logic of how you construct the scientific hypothesis and accept it on probation, that is like accepted as a tentative hypothesis. And then he kind of situates that in an overall process of, well, it's like a nice messy flowchart. Here you create hypotheses with abduction, you test them with a combination of deduction and induction, you draw out predictions from them, and you look if those predictions obtain, you make some sort of probability estimate, and then you end up saying, well, this is this likely, and then you start all over again. And science is like this infinitely going loop, this recursive process that keeps checking itself, creating new hypotheses, and then hopefully over time that process is truth oriented. But for him, he kind of has to take that on faith and be an optimist, because that's like one of the big problems is how is that process actually oriented towards finding reality? So, like, big picture, that's a lot of philosophy of science is dealing with that kind of thing. And the way I approach it is through that lens of trying to kind of work out the kinks in that sort of system of the logic of inquiry. Does that make sense? Or I just ramble?
No, no, yeah. So, it seems so. Maybe I can like try to repeat a little bit of what you said there. So, um, what is often meant when we talk about the scientific process is actually more like a series of processes, like almost an iterative, like tons of processes that we're doing over and over and over again. And maybe I don't know if you exactly went here, but maybe rather instead of like finding the truth, it's more like just eliminating falsehoods, kind of, you know.
Yeah.
And like
Yes.
each iteration, we're just like, hey, let's run with this idea and test it. Oh nope, that one's not right. Let's try again. Okay, new process. Nope, that's not right. Okay, try again. Hey, we got something. And then we kind of build on that and we go from there. So all of these different processes is what we mean when we talk about the scientific process, which perhaps is a not super well-fitting name, but beyond that too, that's just kind of like human reasoning in general, right? That's not it's not like it's like this unique to science way of thinking about things. It's just kind of that is perhaps, if I may be so bold, like proper reasoning almost.
Yes. No, that's a great way to summarize it. Yeah. So you open up any science textbook, right? At any level. When I was an undergrad in college, and even when I look at grad level, like biology text, no matter what the level, the first chapter is like, here's a scientific method, hypothesis, testing. Then it becomes a theory. And then you do peer review and things like that over and over and over again, right? And it's just none of those are accurate. It's not that simple. The difference between even like a hypothesis and a theory in the actual historical literature, there is no difference between a hypothesis and a theory. They're two words for the same thing. But we just use them like there's so much I guess, how would I put it? There's not a uniform vocabulary to talk about these things. And a lot of scientists aren't actually trained in the philosophy and history of science, so that when they go to write a textbook, they're kind of just being like, well, here's kind of what we do. But it's not, when you see the scientific method like that, it's not only oversimplified, but sometimes it's just outright false. Because one of the things that a lot of textbooks, even contemporary textbooks, the last textbook I used for my biology class, because I was doing a biology teaching credential for high school, so I just took this a few months ago. The textbook literally said, like, what makes science so unique is a hypothetical deductive method, which is you create an explanation and set it up like a deductive argument where you go premise one, premise two, premise three. Those imply the conclusion. Well, and then all you have to do is look for, did it fail to predict something? And then you rule it out, right? You slash, if it fails to predict one thing, then you slash it out and it's like, we're done. That's what philosophers Hempel, I can't remember his co-author's name, but basically what they said in the 1940s to 1960s, that's just completely outdated. That's been dead for 40 years, since the 1980s, maybe even earlier. So when you actually take a science class and try to get this type of stuff, like, it just is so oversimplified and so not informed on the actual literature history of these things that most science students or people taking science don't really actually know what science is or what they're doing. They never really raise those questions unless they're really curious or they have a strangely educated professor or something. Yeah. And like you're saying, at the end of the day, if C.S. Peirce is even partly right, then the scientific method can't be understood as any sort of linear process. It's this reiterative loop of all of these different mental processes going on that are common to all of the different disciplines, any truth-seeking or knowledge-seeking discipline. And it goes in a loop over and over and over again, and it gets really messy. Sometimes you do things out of order. At most, what we can do is kind of make an idealized flowchart and examine the different processes that go into it. But it's kind of impossible to just say, like, and this is the scientific method.
Yeah, I see that. It's not as simple. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you don't mind me interrupting with a question from the audience, so Dale has a question, and Dale is from the channel Real Seekers, and it might be worth me just kind of taking a moment to say that the Real Seekers YouTube channel is a very interesting one because it is a very empirical channel. So Dale focuses on the Shroud of Turin a lot, and like really gets into the details, really gets into the nitty gritty on the most recent science about the Shroud of Turin. And I mean, hey, if that's not part of like, you know, the scientific kind of landscape, if that's not a marriage of science and religion, then I don't know what is.
Yeah.
But Dale has this question: how can empiricism be a better method than the non-empirical presuppositions it utilizes to work? I have two thoughts here. Pierce, do you want to kind of take a stab at this before I do, or?
Yeah, I mean, I could just give a quick thought because you'll probably have more to say on this. I'm not myself, I guess I'm empirically inclined, but I'm not myself bound to any sort of strict empiricism. So I would just say, well, empiricism, instead of talking about empiricism in general, let me talk about like empirically based knowledge and methods that use empirical or observational data to construct theories or confirm or disconfirm hypotheses. How can those somehow be better, or it seems like he's saying more privileged or more reliable than the foundational assumptions they rest on? And I guess the answer would be, for me, is they can't. But the non-empirical presuppositions that it rests on are so generic and so vague that they really don't tell you anything about the world. And in my opinion, even those foundations aren't certain and they're fallible. So that at the end of the day, I personally don't believe that there is anything such as certain knowledge, right? So it's like, I get what he's saying. I get that it's like, well, yeah, empirical methods and empirical knowledge rely on non-empirical a priori knowledge or something like that. Or even a priori processes and logical methods in us that are instinctive. But yeah, I guess it just doesn't really matter to me, just because I'm not saying they're better. It's just that those foundations don't really tell me much about the world. They can't settle a debate.
That's exactly where I was kind of going with this one. So I think that a lot kind of hinges upon what Dale means when he says better. So if we can kind of have a definition of better that is inclusive of something like, you know, it's just how can it be more useful? Well, then the answer is quite easy, I think, actually. Like, just those non-empirical presuppositions don't really tell us a whole lot about anything about the world. But then once we kind of have this empirical method, once we assume the logical laws as kind of like axiomatically true, and then we kind of have this empirical method, we can actually find out a lot of really useful stuff, right? That's how we build our cell phones and our computers and all that stuff. So if Dale's only question was like, you know, what is more useful, or how can empiricism be more useful? I think it's just like it's a scope thing. Like the scope is just like much wider. But perhaps that's not what he meant, and maybe what he meant is like, how can we be more sure? And then I'm totally with you right there. It's, well, we can't be more sure. But then I'm also right there with you, and I say, but I'm also not sure about the logical laws. It's not like I don't claim to have absolute knowledge about, you know, the laws of identity and non-contradiction and excluded middle. I live my life as if they're true, and every time that I check them empirically, they seem to hold up. But that doesn't mean that they're definitely true all the time, everywhere, you know, full stop. Yeah. So in that sense, empiricism isn't better than the non-empirical presuppositions. But it certainly seems more useful in as much as we can do more with it. That's kind of my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. Like, I think just if we were just like non-sensory beings that didn't have beliefs or anything based on observational data, like, what our lives would not be very interesting just contemplating logical forms and things like that. Like, logic is made, in my opinion, like it really seems made to be a tool to apply to the world, not just something that you just sit there and you're like, I love logic.
right. There's, thinking about something that is X and it's also not X. You're not really, and the moment that you plug in some kind of variable for X, you're already doing empiricism in the sense that like you've already selected something that you've identified using your sense perception. So, anyway, And Dale just says, thanks for the helpful answers. Okay, so sorry for the brief kind of interlude there. What we were talking about was kind of the history of the scientific method. Um, we touched on bullet point number 2 a little bit. Let me read it out loud and see if you have any like further thoughts here. So science is shot through with pragmatic assumptions that in fact are most basic reasoning processes. And then you also you wanted to add a note about the limits of science and about inquiry. Did you have, I know we touched a little bit on like kind of the pragmatic side of science already, but did you have any additional thoughts there?
Yeah, that this is one of my favorite topics because I myself don't have my mind up made about certain things. I again find myself not drawn to taking hard positions on things, but looking at the history, looking at all these different views, trying to see the shades of nuance, and letting it sit with me. So I think I need several more decades before I have a strong opinion on some things. But so one of the very basic things, and it's kind of, I could talk like for 50 hours about this, so I'm going to try to condense it down real low. It seems to me, and it seems to C.S. Peirce and people who follow his train of thought, that the basic ingredients of the scientific method, or the process that contains all these processes, is that you create a hypothesis by essentially making up a story in your head. This is what a theory is, an explanation is. You make up a story in your head that purports to tell you the real reasons why something happened. And you're doing essentially a reverse reconstruction of an argument. So rather than starting with the premises, going to the conclusion, you start with the conclusion, the thing you observed or the thing you think is true, and you try to work backwards to a set of explanans, a set of claims about the world that posit certain entities, certain causal relationships, certain laws of nature, whatever you want to call them, that would either entail or make likely the conclusion. So the first step in science is like hypothesis construction, where you're kind of going backwards like that. And your human creativity is amazing. There are technically an infinite number of hypotheses for any given observational date, right? So there is no end. I could just tweak a hypothesis, suddenly it's a new hypothesis, and I can just do that ad infinitum, right? So just the very nature of what it is to construct a theory or an explanation already faces you with this frankly irresolvable philosophical problem called the problem of proliferation of hypotheses. And it is that for any given data you want to explain, there are technically an infinite number of equally powerful, that is, they all predict the data in the same way, with the same strength. There are an infinite number of equally powerful hypotheses that you have to pick from. And so I call this pragmatic limiting, but the first pragmatic step is, well, I have to go with a finite number of these to start doing science. I can't test an infinity of theories. So the first pragmatic problem is that just to get off the ground to test or experiment or confirm or falsify anything, I have to narrow it down to some finite set of theories. A detective solving a murder could never do, like, he would never be able to prosecute anyone, right? So you have to pragmatically limit that. Some philosophers have ideas about how you do that, but overall, that seems like to me, a step that can only be done through like economical and pragmatic considerations, not something that can be done in like a perfectly rational, in a sense that like there's some evidence of how I limit these, right? It's like a choice we make based on our needs, I guess.
Yeah. So is your point here something like like theoretically almost anything could be caused by almost anything, and there is not enough time since the beginning of the universe until whenever it ends to test every single possibility of what could be causing something. So we have this kind of pragmatic junction that we get to where we just kind of have to say like, well, could it be that, the reason why, the one cue ball hit the other cue ball and the cue ball moved, could it be because there was some butterfly on the other side of the earth that flapped its wings? Like, you can't rule that out like a priori.
Yeah.
However, it just seems so unlikely that you're just not going to consider it on pragmatic grounds. Kind of is that kind of the whole point?
Yeah, yeah, basically. Except when we judge that things like that are unlikely, that's one thing. But the other thing is that if here's a concrete example of how ridiculous like the foundations of science can get. It's like even in a concrete example like this, let's say I work at a bank. I work at a bank and the power goes out and all my boss tells me is, hey, this really wealthy client had $1,000 in this one bank account, because to me as a philosopher $1,000 is rich. um, so he had $1,000 in his bank account. When he got back, he only had 25 after the power came back on. I need you to figure out what happened. The computers have no data on this. How many ways can you reconstruct the theory about what happened?
Oh, like
An infinite number.
yeah.
Yeah, because I can go, well, maybe a thief came and took 50 cents and then took $999.5 or whatever. Or maybe he took $2 and then 998, or he just took all of that. Right? It's literally for something as simple as that. There are literally an infinite number of equally powerful explanations for that, he's suddenly missing all that money, right? Now, how do you figure out which one's at best? How do you estimate? Well, it's probably not likely that the thief did it in, $1,001 steps or whatever. To make even that judgment gets you into the second point where a lot of philosophers think that to even be able to narrow it is a pragmatic choice, and it would be something like Occam's razor or simplicity, right? Occam's razor says essentially, if you can explain something while positing a lesser number of entities, do that.
Mm-hmm.
There is a insanely lengthy literature on what exactly that means and how you justify it. A lot of people disagree with it. A lot of people think maybe that's a good pragmatic move, but it's not really an evidence-based one. That is, simplicity is not a guide to truth. It's just a pragmatic move. But the really important thing in that debate is that that's not the only kind of theoretical simplicity there is. There is a lot more to the idea of simplicity than that. So it's like, for instance, simplicity could be like Occam's razor, the number of entities you posit. It could also be the number of causal powers or relationships you posit. It can also be how coherent or how simple it is to understand for an audience. It can also be how easy to test it is, like the simplicity of the economics of it. It could also mean, Karl Popper would analyze simplicity like this: how easy it is to falsify, how easy it is to show that it's wrong. Because the simpler a theory is, the less predictions it makes. And the less predictions you make, the harder you are to refute. He would actually say that the simpler in one sense, the simpler the theory, the more likely, but you should actually start with the more complex theories because they're the easier to rule out. And if a more complex theory isn't ruled out, then that counts as way more evidence for it, right? And so there's this just really, like, it literally took me like 3 or 4 years to get through this literature on all the different senses of simplicity, and I still don't have my mind made up. And yet, I'm probably one of like a couple hundred people in history that have gone through that literature in that depth. I still don't have my mind made up on it. What does that say about other philosophers and other scientists and historians and psychologists, blah, 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 that actually use these reasoning processes, but they don't actually have they haven't tried to settle that issue? That means that they have to be doing something other than just pure evidential reasoning, right? I'm sure there's all sorts of these pragmatic issues coming up, and they're just choosing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so, what do you think that these pragmatic issues are? Do you think it's just like a matter of like, hey, look, in the past, explanations have been more similar to X than Y, therefore I'm going to start with things that are closer to X than Y, stuff
Right.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I you know I don't know if you've read Thomas Kuhn's work, but his like the logic or wait, what is it? The structure of scientific revolutions, and he has another book, The Copernican Revolution. His point is that one of the major things in how science unfolds is that we don't start in a vacuum. We're starting with whatever the previous generation handed to us as a likely paradigm of scientific explanation. Like, this is what we find plausible. These are the methods we use. These are our interests, even. Um, those are handed to us by the last generation, and we're either going to modify, accept, or reject them. And so when we come in to do science, we're not starting from a Cartesian ignorance and building our way up. We've been handed a research project, and that's already setting the trajectory. That's already limiting the possible alternatives there are. And even when we have a complete paradigm shift, that paradigm shift is still a shift out of and determined by the bounds of whatever came before us.
We're not starting from scratch. We're not reinventing the wheel every single time that we kind of consider a new solution to an old problem. Is
right,
kind of
yeah.
yeah. Okay. And do you see I guess do you see this as like I guess a feature or a bug or kind of neither, like the fact that we're not constantly reinventing the wheel here?
Yeah. Oh God. I see. This is where like my rationalism comes out, because like I would really like for every single scientist and philosopher to know everything and to reinvent the wheel every single time.
Right.
Like I personally think that would be, if we had a much longer lifespan, everybody should be educated in all of this, and not and essentially start from a blank slate and work your way up. That's not possible.
Right.
It's just not possible. So I guess it's just part of being human that we're limited like this. I personally wish it wasn't this way, but it's the best we can do, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think about like computer programming a little bit. So full disclosure, I do not do any actual computer programming as part of like my day job. As part of engineering school, I did have to learn a little bit of MATLAB. MATLAB is a language that only like STEM people use. It's not particularly useful. It's really just kind of Excel but harder.
Yeah.
But it is a programming language. I don't know the first thing about how languages even work, but I do know a little bit about how to use them to solve problems.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if every single person who ever wrote a single line of Java actually had to like understand like how computers actually work, right?
Yeah.
Like that no computer programmer could, like, there's no one person who could tell you every single little detail about how a computer works, because there's just too many pieces in any given computer, right? The guy who's the expert on motherboards probably can't tell you exactly how a power supply works, and the guy who's an expert on power supplies probably can't tell you exactly how it is that a solid state drive works, right? And yeah, like you said, maybe things would be different if we all lived to be 1,000 years old, but we don't. And since we don't, we kind of have to silo ourselves into these little spheres. Otherwise, we would have never gotten we wouldn't have gotten as far as we did if we didn't kind of silo ourselves, right?
Yeah, we would be intellectually paralyzed, right?
Yeah.
We'd spend our entire life doing and okay, as a person, I have like pretty severe OCD. And when I started doing philosophy, one of the first things I read was Descartes' Meditations, where he goes into a little cabin and gets rid of everything. And I remember it's like an 18-year-old just starting college was like, I'm going to do that. I'm going to try that. I'm not accepting anything unless there's an argument for it that I can't doubt, or that's at least extremely probable. And that like literally took like 5 years of my life away from me because I was so OCD about that I would take a history class and not really learn anything, because I'm like, cite that, give me a footnote, cite where that happened, give me your data on every little thing. It just, life doesn't work like that. Like, that's not how humans, if there's knowledge for human beings, that is not how we get it. that just cripples you.
Yeah, yeah. And so here, maybe I'll tie a little bit of religion into this by saying I actually, and people might look at me funny for saying this, but I respect the project of religion in as much as like particularly within like trad Catholicism at least, there's like this big focus on the tradition. And I think that the focus on the tradition is there specifically because we can't start from
Yeah.
zero and get to where we are today every single we have to stand on the shoulders of giants. Um and I remember when I kind of told my family that I wasn't religious anymore. One and my so my dad's an engineer, right? So my dad's like me in as much as he's like empirically minded. um but he's religious, so he's not entirely like me.
Yeah.
I should say I'm not entirely like him. Um but like his whole point to me when I kind of told him that I was leaving religion was um like why not trust the wisdom of the people who kind of came before us? You do that with science. Why do you treat religion differently? And like that made me pause, right? And I think that's like, I think that's a fair point.
Yeah.
You can't start from zero every single lifetime. And so, that doesn't stop me from using a cell phone just because I don't understand how it works entirely. So why should that stop me from being part of a religion? Now, you know, I have responses there, but I think that kind of underlying principle it's not a bad principle, I don't think.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. Yeah, and I've thought that myself too. I've struggled with that exact question at certain points because it makes sense. Um, my ultimate reaction to it was, well, guess what? I don't believe science either. I'm not accepting science, the scientific tradition either, because I'm this radical OCD Cartesian when I was younger, and I don't. I mean, I can understand the theories of science and take these classes, but I'm not for a second buying that they represent reality until someone shows me the data, shows me their experimental methods. So I'm just going to be skeptical of everything. And that would be my response to that, is like, that's what I personally have always leaned more towards. And I'll use it as a tool. I'll use it to make money. I'll use it to maybe make sense and be able to predict the future and navigate the world. But I can still kind of remain just like completely skeptical about basically everything. So does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And I'll even say that I think like a pretty standard part of the empirical, like the definition of like what empiricism is, right? Is that like, any any knowledge would come through sense perception, if knowledge comes at all, right? I think
Yeah.
that's generally part of like the empiricism thing. Um so I think that kind of position that you just outlined there is kind of in line with the empirical tradition, because like empiricists very well can be like, oh yeah, no, it's very possible that all of this knowledge isn't knowledge at all, in as much as it doesn't actually describe reality. It's just our best it's our best approximation, and it works for predicting enough stuff that I live my life, and hey, like, look, it's made me some money. So, you know
Yeah.
um but yeah. um
There's a really, if I could follow up on that, there's a really great philosopher of science, Bas van Frossen, who's he's still alive, writing great stuff. He's a scientific anti-realist, but his entire project is showing that, like, well, look, if you want to be an empiricist, empiricism really entails scientific anti-realism and like a severe pragmatic skepticism about basically anything metaphysical, and that includes whether scientific theories actually accurately represent reality. And I really like his work, and I'm like very drawn to that attitude. On the other hand, I'm also drawn to more metaphysical speculation. I think some arguments for like God's existence work in kind of a limited way. So it's like two parts of my soul are being torn there. But but yeah, I think part of the empirical tradition people have to take seriously is that the empiricist will at the very least be open minded to, like, yeah, there's not real like true knowledge. Maybe there's probable knowledge, probable opinion, but not in that classic sense of like, we know this is true with anything approximating certainty at all.
Yeah, yeah. And I find in my conversations with people who are more on the pop apologetics side of the conversation, like I find that this kind of part of the um like where I've kind of made my peace with the idea that like yeah, like you know, we use empiricism to get the closest that we can, but it's quite possible that the closest that we can get is not very close at all. Like
Yeah.
I kind of made my peace with that like a while ago. And I feel like that's just like not necessarily intuitive to like your average person. Like
Yeah.
there seems to be this reaction against the idea, like this, like a reaction against radical skepticism, kind of.
Right.
Where it's like, no, I really do know some things, right? Like I know for a fact that my wife loves me, right? That's kind of like a classic example. And so I think that like sometimes there's like a little bit of a hitch in the conversation when we get to this kind of radical skepticism that I've kind of made peace with, but I don't think everyone has made peace with it. Do you get kind of the same impression?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, when you really take, when you really start being able to take skepticism seriously, like, yeah, even knowledge that your wife loves you, it comes into the question. Now, is there a solution to that type of thing? My mind remains open. Um, I do not live as though I am a skeptic. Like, I do have opinions.
Yes.
But that's another pragmatic thing. I'm not
Yes.
saying that, yes, in theoretically, technically, I don't actually know. I may think things are probable, but I'll never have certainty. So, in the classical sense of I have to have certainty to know something, I don't know anything. But I'm going to commit myself to things. I'm going to still live like this. I'm not going to let it cripple me. Um, but it's just that people think, and I guess I kind of understand on one hand, if you don't have certainty, then you're crippled and you can't live like anything. You can't do anything. And so they have to hold on to that or they're going to fall apart.
Right. And as soon as you kind of realize that like you don't actually need certainty to live your life as though it's true, right? Like you can live your life as though it's true without having absolute certainty about it.
Yeah.
Then I find that the need for that kind of certainty kind of just disappears. Like it's not it's like I'm perfectly happy admitting that I don't know what I don't know and kind of just hey, that's it. There's nothing
Yeah.
I can do about it, kind of. But yeah, I just don't think that everyone is so willing. I don't think that everyone is so comfortable being uncomfortable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so on the one hand, you'll have certain like rad trad type people and people who want to hang on to certainty that God exists and that their religion is true. Then you also have people who want to hang on to the certainty that it's not true and that God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And conversations between those type of people never end well, or never very
Yeah.
informative. Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, I think philosophy and these type of things can really get you to a point where you're very open to these different possibilities. And maybe you're opening yourself up to these other potential realities out there that maybe you could reach out to in a different way through prayer or something like that. But that you're never coming to a dogmatic conclusion, and you're kind of going with the flow. And it is a type of spiritual discipline to get yourself into that mindset. um I think that's really important because yeah, for me too, I'm comfortable with it now, but it took me a long time of like meditating and sitting with it, with
Yeah.
uncertainty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've kept you for almost an hour already, and we have a whole bunch of more topics to get to. Um, I'm wondering if I think we've almost been going to so bullet point number 8, skipping around here. Um, Bullet point number 8 was, I'll just read it. It says arguments for the existence of God. It mentions Aquinas' 5 ways. When paired with your views on the inference to the best explanation, you think that they can open somebody up to the possibility of God. And you like Swinburne's natural law arguments, but there's a limit. So I think where we were kind of trending with the conversation, and if you think that there's like a more productive way to go, for sure, I'm
Yeah.
happy to kind of go in a different direction. But we kind of just ended on this note of like, hey, look, if you take empiricism seriously, you kind of wind up having to get comfortable with like a kind of radical skepticism a little bit. And then, hey, if you're comfortable with that, great. But you did mention that you think that there are other ways that we can kind of wind up with a God belief, and you think that might be kind of compelling. I guess my question for you is, do you find these like theism, these reasons for theism, are they empirical, or are they more like these kind of logical proofs like Aquinas' five ways and stuff like that? Like what's your kind of thought there?
Right. And so that's so like just we'll narrow it down to Aquinas' five ways, because especially the first three, which are like taken as the exemplars of like deductive, purely a priori logical arguments for the existence of God. And I would say I don't think arguments like that are non-empirical. So
Okay.
long story short, all of Aquinas's best arguments for the existence of God work like this. He looks around the world and he finds parts of reality that are puzzling and need an explanation. The framework he's working in is Aristotelian physics and metaphysics. So he's going to use the principles of Aristotelian metaphysics and physics to construct explanations of the experience. Now, the experience itself is being filtered through Aristotelian metaphysics. And this is a general point. Another thing about the pragmatic kind of assumptions in science, experience itself is always interpreted. So there is no raw sense experience. There is no raw empirical data that's like unbiased or something. It's always interpreted in some way. And so what can seem like an a priori deductive argument, a non-empirical argument, if you really think about how he came up with the premises of that argument, how the reasoning of that argument flows, it is from looking at experience, interpreting that experience under an Aristotelian framework, and then drawing out conclusions from what that framework, right? So the whole first mover argument, that only works if there's such a thing as causality, if there's such a thing as causal powers in substances, if substances have powers not just in virtue of corpuscular bodies bouncing off each other, but they have other types of powers, like powers to self-move or powers to move other things. It's all theoretical. It's all an extrapolation from empirical data that then, Aristotle and Aquinas try to make sense of. So it's those arguments are as if you've spent literally 1,000 years or more developing a metaphysical and physics system, and then you say, well, we all kind of believe this system. Given that system, these conclusions fall out about God must exist. And I think that's right. Like I think Aquinas' five ways convince me, but they always convince me with a caveat of, but I'm thinking like an Aristotelian. There's other ways to think. And so at the end of the day, it's still not something I'm certain about. It's sort of, well, Aristotelian metaphysics, a very basic version of that, seems plausible to me as a good way of making sense of the world. On that hypothesis, I see that it's pretty likely that God exists or something like God. And so, given that I'm roughly an Aristotelian, or that I'm attracted to that, I will assess the probability of God's existence as, higher than 50%, something like that.
Yeah.
But there's so many caveats in there that it's not like, yes, Aquinas' five ways work. I believe. It's like, I do believe, but I believe for more than just, there has to be something beyond just those arguments. Does that make sense? Sorry, I rolled a lot of stuff in there.
No, it does. And it's funny, you're definitely not an ortho bro because you have way too much tentative knowledge, right? If you were an ortho bro, you would just say Aquinas' five ways, and then that would be that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so here's what I'll say about Aquinas' five ways. So I guess I'm really not an Aristotelian. Like I just think that Aristotle's physics was like good for 2,000 plus years ago. I just, I think that, like, generally speaking, ever since the Enlightenment, we've kind of come up with better physics. But all of that being said, I I don't have this like visceral guttural reaction against Aquinas' five ways that a lot of people would expect me to have, given that I'm a an ex-trad, right?
Mm.
Like I kind of think of the idea of their like there was some first thing that moved. I'm kind of like, yeah, okay, sure, you know. Um, that doesn't seem unreasonable to me. Now, like, certainly I don't know that beyond the shadow of a doubt. Um, but yeah, the idea that there was something that moved first. Yeah, I mean, that kind of sounds right,
Yeah.
Um, now, I suppose where I get off the train is that, like, I feel like a lot of people will appeal to Aquinas' five ways and then kind of pull like a William Lane Craig kind of move and then be like, oh, and so like, therefore God has to be personal and stuff like that. And I think that's where I start to be like, well, I'm with you up until, there was something that moved first, right? And then I kind of get off the train a little bit. But yeah, like broadly speaking, I don't have some kind of like visceral reaction against Aquinas' five ways that I think a lot of people expect me to have.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that comes across in your channel of you being
Okay,
a
good.
fairly open-minded person. Like, yeah, I've never understood visceral reactions for or against. Like, they just don't. When I first learned about them in college, it did not strike me as super plausible. Now I think they're more plausible, but I still don't really. They're not my life. I'm not
Right.
gonna defend them. That's not the hill I die on.
Right.
It's also I don't understand, like they're basically mocked by a lot of people even still today, a lot of philosophers even. Um and I just don't I again, maybe it's not my personality to latch onto extremes, but yeah.
So I have like a theory about the mocking. Let me hit you with it and see what you think. I think that a lot of like the kind of mocking of like Thomism in general in the philosophical community is less about Thomism and more about people who are Thomists.
Yeah.
Because I think that a lot of the Thomists study Aquinas without studying anyone else,
Mm.
And so I think that there's like a lot of like people who are Thomists aren't doing their due diligence on any other philosopher besides Aquinas.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
I think that some of the mocking in the philosophical community is aimed more so at Aquinas' fans and less so at Aquinas himself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's exactly the feeling I have. One of my favorite philosophers is David Bentley Hart, and he just mercilessly like hates Thomas and mocks him every chance he gets. But then at every turn, he's like, "Oh, I love Thomas Aquinas. Like, I think he's right." But yeah, Thomas are a different beast. Yeah,
Heart is that all shall be saved, right? That's
yeah, that all shall
yeah,
be saved.
yeah.
And my favorite books of his are The Experience of God and Atheist Delusions, which is a funny title.
It is. I have to admit, I'm really only like familiar with like to put it in music terms, like Bentley Hart's radio hits.
Yeah,
That's really like the extent
yeah.
of my familiarity.
Oh man, both of those are like, I think, required reading. You gotta
Okay.
read those at some point. Not because they're like gonna convince you, but because they show you the alternative of how you could do philosophy and theology and think about these things, not from the current vogue of like um, radical empiricism, but also orthobro type stuff. Yeah,
Okay.
uh, it's a nice, much different speculative approach to these types of things.
Cool.
Great role model.
I'll put
Yeah,
them on the list.
yeah, definitely.
The book I'm reading right now is so Dr. Jim Madden just came out with a new book on philosophy of mind that I'm reading.
Oh yeah,
Um, but and he's been on the channel a few times. So I'm making sure that I read that one so I can talk to him about it. But I'll put some Heart on the list right after because hey, if it's required reading, then I better.
it's so good. I mean, I I love Dave Bentley Hart. Yeah, I won't shill for him much more. But
Okay. Okay.
yeah,
Um,
they're great.
I
There was one thing that you said that I think was really right about the five ways. By the way, that I want to not brush past, if that's okay.
yeah, let's do it.
You said that you don't really understand the William Lane Craig move of you go through the five ways or arguments like that, and then you say, and that's the Christian God, the God of, greatest conceivable being, right? There's a really interesting book I just finished by Christopher Martin on Aquinas' 5 ways and reading them in light of medieval science. And he confirmed something that I'd thought for a long time, is that the 5 ways do not conclude in the existence of God in terms of like a robust sense of God. They're literally only concluding in, like, basically what Aquinas is doing is, well, here's what most people mean by God. Because for him, if something isn't empirically observable, the only way you can confirm a non-observed entity exists is by saying, what does the name signify? That is, what do we normally mean with the term? And then we'll see if something in reality matches that. So he basically says, well, what do most people mean by God? Well, in one sense of God, it's that which is the first cause of, or efficient cause of motion. Well, he argues and says there must be a first efficient cause of motion. That's it. And he says that's what people call God. So God exists in some sense. What is God? He does that with each of the 5 ways. So even when you take all the 5 ways together, you know, I would say, I'm looking at my notes right here, you'd get, there is some sort of source of efficient causality, a first causer. There is some sort of source of being and existence. There is a source of, there must be a necessary being, would be the 3rd way. There must be something to coordinate the transcendentals, which are like truth, beauty, goodness, that sort of thing. There must be something where they all cohere and are coordinated. And then there must be some sort of source of teleology or purpose in the cosmos. And those could all be different things, or maybe they could all be one thing. But the goal, after you establish that any theory, at least for the first 3 ways, I think we would say any metaphysical theory has to have these features. The question is, inference the best explanation. What best explains that? And the traditional God of theism is one of those explanations. It's a matter of having to weigh and balance then, right?
Yeah, it almost seems like the 5 ways are kind of more humble than what a lot of the maybe like the online rad trads who like kind of like parrot them would maybe have you believe.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I think after reading this book, I'm 100% convinced that that is the case. Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty cool. If you don't mind, can I interrupt with another question from the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I have as long as you want to talk. So,
okay, awesome. You know. Yeah, we're in the middle of great stuff, and we have too many topics to cover today. So let's at least do this question, and then if we want to do one more topic, I think we totally can. I don't want to keep you forever, but let's do this question and see where this takes us. So again, from Dale. Dale says that he finds Orthodox practitioners tend to need absolute infallible knowledge on theology through tradition. Do you think that we need absolute knowledge? Do you think we need absolute knowledge is unneeded regardless of topic, or do some topics require it? So,
oh gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know a lot of people who do need that, or who think they need that. Yes. Do you actually need it? No. And if we did, we'd be screwed. We don't have it. Yeah. I don't, you know, if we're talking about actual people, concrete people, some people need it or they'll go insane. If we're talking about like, does our theology, do our religious beliefs and practices need it? I would say no. I don't see even dogmatic definitions as being something that the church is like, and the metaphysics behind these are 100% infallible, and we're presupposing this metaphysical system that is correct, and you have to believe it, or else everything falls apart. I don't see it working like that.
So not only do I agree, but let me kind of compliment. So Dale is a Christian, but and I don't know if Dale has a denomination like in particular, but he's definitely like a Protestant type of Christian, I believe. And Dale, I'm sorry if I got that wrong, but let me compliment Orthodoxy and kind of not just all non-Catholic Christianities. I find that this kind of comfortability with not having any kind of absolute knowledge is present in non-Catholic Christianities. But with Catholic Christianity, all of the dogma of the church these Marian dogmas. That's something that I find really, I'm not happy with it, right? Um, so the idea that the church kind of had, like, it has this list of things that, like, these are true beyond any shadow of a doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and it's kind of like, I find them just weird hills to die on. Like the perpetual virginity of Mary is a dogma. That's something that we know with so much certainty that we can, that
Right.
so,
Yeah.
so I find that, like, really just, like, it leaves a sour taste in my mouth a little bit.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I did not, return to Catholicism after my experiences with Protestantism, because essentially in my head the choices were always, I'm either not going to be a Christian or I'm going to be Catholic or Orthodox. I just could not. I can't. I've never been able to stomach the approach that Catholics have, that the Catholic Church tends to have, of like, we can basically put everything in a catechism and line it up, and that there are so many infallible teachings, and even the principle of infallibility of the pontiff in general. Like, it's one thing to say I don't agree with their conclusions, and I don't think that I think the Pope is not infallible. It's another thing to just say, like, I don't know if I can believe that. Like, I just don't. And if I can't believe that, then how am I going to fit into the Catholic Church?
Yeah, the Catholic Church kind of backs itself into a bit of a corner in some ways, because, like, imagine that you are a Catholic, but you just think that the church isn't actually infallible. Like, at the face of it, you might think, like, that's fine. You just disagree with the church on something. But now you're part of an organization that claims that it can't be wrong, and you're saying that it can be wrong. And I don't know, I feel like a little bit of tension there. And I know that there are some people who kind of live in that tension and they're happy with it, and they're like, yeah, that's fine. Like, so what? The church says that she's infallible. I say she's not. That's all right. And, like, to them, I say, like, hats off to you, I guess.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I just find the whole concept of anything being infallible to just kind of be, like, really distasteful. The word that I always use, and I'm still looking for, like, a more charitable way to say this, but the word is anti-intellectual. And I do stand by that word, not because I'm trying to be some kind of, like, jerk about it, but because, like, that's, like, the most accurate word that I can find. And if there was, like, a more charitable way to say that, I would find that way. But just the whole concept of defining something as something that you cannot possibly be wrong about just really sits with me kind of wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Now, honestly, in the back of my head, I watch so many of Michael Lofton's videos that, like, I hear him in the back of my head going, no, you have to understand the nuance of
That's right.
infallibility.
That's the nuance.
No.
Yep.
And so
Repent.
I'm gonna say something wrong here. Oh God. But yes, I understand that. I agree with it. That's why I did not become Catholic. I am open to the possibility that God guides his church in such a way that everything the Catholics say is true. Like, I'm open to that possibility. I don't know if I'll ever have evidence of it. I don't know if I'll ever have a really good reason to think that. But I pray nearly every day that if that is true, that God shows me that and leads me back to Catholic Church, or if it's not true, he has me stay in Orthodox or wherever he wants me. But that's not something that I don't think I'll ever be able to decide through actual reason. And so if you're coming at your spiritual life from purely a reason perspective, I don't see how anybody converts to Catholicism with that in mind, unless they're open to basically being dishonest. Because the thing about Catholic and Orthodox here, or anything that takes the Eucharist really seriously, is that there are certain requirements they want you to meet to be able to partake of the Eucharist together. And if you believe in not even, like, transubstantiation, but just the real presence anyway, it's something you have to take seriously. And so if you are in your church and your priest or your bishop wants you to basically conform to Catholic, at least some minimal criteria of Catholicity, to take it, and you don't, and you still take it anyway, you're hiding it from your priest, and you might be receiving unworthily, and that scares the crap out of me. And I think it should. So I don't understand how you can be in the Catholic Church and basically like, well, the church is infallible. I disagree with the church, right? Like that would scare me too much. I don't know.
Yeah. And if I can say a word in defense of Catholics, it'll be that um, I don't believe that like the majority or anything even close to the majority of Catholics are people who are actually kind of like okay with being like dishonest with themselves.
Yeah,
I think that a lot of Catholics are kind of the mindset where it's like, hey, look, I'm not a subject matter expert. I never will be a subject matter expert. I'm going to kind of like, in some ways, I think that Catholics do what I do when it comes to cell phones. Like I just kind of
yeah,
trust that I trust that they're going to work. I don't really understand how they work, but I use them anyway. Um, and so I think that what a lot of Catholics do is they look at the church and they're like, yeah, like I don't really get how the church is infallible, but like I'm just going to trust that it is kind of a little bit, which is to some extent what I do with cell phones. So I don't think that they're all I don't think that Catholics by and large are dishonest in any way. Um,
yeah.
I just think that and I'm so sorry about those notifications.
Oh, you're fine. I'm not even noticing them honestly,
Okay,
so I don't
cool.
care. Sorry to the chat, but I, if that's what you're taking away from this video, is you're annoyed by that. Weird.
Yeah,
I
then
I completely agree with you. I think there's something actually beautiful to it. I think one of the things that my hero C.S. Peirce says about science is that you have to kind of take it. You're looking at humanity as one organism, and it's like a hive mind almost. Like you're working together to further scientific knowledge. No one person is ever going to understand, but it's hopefully as a species we are getting further knowledge. And it might be the same thing with religion. Not everybody in this life is going to be a subject matter expert. Maybe it would be nice if like I said earlier, maybe it'd be nice if we all could. Fact is, we're not. So there may be a role of trusting the experts, the people who devoted their life to it. And, I'm comfortable with that in some places. I'm comfortable with that with some things in Orthodoxy, like the perpetual virginity of Mary. I did not believe when I was a catechumen, and it took me a long time to see the reasoning behind it. But yeah, so I get that.
yeah, yeah. Now, maybe one thing I will add about that is um, I don't hold that cell phones work with the same level of certainty
Yeah,
that would be required of me to hold the perpetual virginity of Mary were I to become Catholic.
right. Yes.
And so I think that's important. So, here I am defending the Catholic Church, and now let me walk that back because,
Yeah.
because
No, but there's a big difference. Like that's just an analogy, right? But
Right.
there's a big difference between trusting a piece of technology to do things for you and trusting that there is this metaphysical system that the salvation and status of your soul in relationship to the fundamental reality that is God itself is connecting you to, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Big difference.
I agree. What do you say? Do you have time? We'll do one more topic.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Did you have
and-
a question? Sorry, I interrupted. Did you have a question pulled up?
Oh, so I did have one. So, first of all, this is a super chat.
$10.
You gotta be.
April the jerk. That's awesome.
I'll have you know, this is my channel's first super chat too, ever. First super chat ever. Kevin is a big jerk. Pass it on. I have to read it out loud. Thank you, Veritas. It's
That's
true.
Amazing.
And I did have something pulled up, and Colin is being sarcastic here. But so Colin grew up in the exact same church that I did, so FSSP, and is not Catholic now, just like me. And so Colin says, you gotta love being too scared of the wrath of God to eat a particular piece of bread, which is exactly how it looks on the outside.
Yeah.
But when you're like, if I put on my Catholic hat, right, then it makes total sense that like I should be scared of eating a particular piece of bread because I'm not in communion with the church, right?
Right.
So, yeah. I just kind of thought that was funny.
No, that is funny. I mean, yeah, from the outside, it looks weird.
Yeah.
It looks weird.
Yeah.
Like I am completely. I won't even describe it here. I have one experience with like maybe taking it unworthily and then getting super sick, right? Like minutes after. And I'm like, I don't actually believe that that happened, or I will never know. But just the possibility kind of scares me still. And I look at myself from the outside. I'm like, that's so weird. You're such a weird freak, Pierce.
Positive affirmations, right?
Yeah, exactly. Positive self-talk.
um, what do you time for one more topic? Maybe out of the topics that we had,
I have almost infinite time.
let's do one
So
more.
yeah.
And I'll give you dealer's choice. Um, oh, we had the whole ethics thing. Christian ethics as cosmic. Um,
Yeah.
we had kind of nihilism. Just I think in general, we were aesthetics as well. Um, yeah. Is there anywhere in particular that you want to go?
Um, I think like the Christian ethical paradigm would be interesting as kind of like a because it kind of relates into the question of like why believe if you can't have conclusive evidence,
Okay.
things like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things I study that I kind of fell into studying over the last couple of years is um, not normative ethics in the sense that it's on a lot of academic philosophy, but kind of historical, what you might call meta ethics, of looking at like the relationship between what it means for God to be like the good, or God to be beauty, God to be love and truth, and how Christians conceived of like good and evil in pretty radically Neoplatonic ways, like evil's a mere deprivation. I know you have a video on that. So I've really become, I don't know if I'd say an expert, but definitely a someone very well read and has a good grasp on kind of the traditional Christian moral paradigm, not talking about particular moral issues like abortion, homosexuality, things like that, but in general, like what morality is. How did the church fathers, how have our theologians thought about what morality actually is? Um, which is something that I think has been overlooked in our, you know, I would really say since like the 20th century, we've just completely lost the sense of like what Christianity actually says morality is fundamentally. And I've got a book next year coming out about it with Choir Publishing.
Ooh.
But uh, basically, what I found is my master's thesis was a weird mess of meta ethics where I was like, why do we even care about nihilism? Why does it make us so anxious? What produces that angst psychologically and philosophically? Like, what's the root of that? What are we worrying about essentially? And so I looked at like Tolstoy and William James and Camus and Nietzsche. And my conclusion was that, well, wait a minute, it makes a lot of sense to kind of wed Thomas Kuhn's stuff about paradigms to morality. And my idea was there is this like big system moral paradigm, conceptual scheme that if we believe in that, if that's the moral paradigm we inherit, then nihilism or even types of like Kantian ethics, utilitarianism threaten to completely wipe out meaning and purpose from our lives and value because they're in tension with like these again these foundational conceptual concepts and conceptual presuppositions that we have been handed. Um, and what I really realized out of that is with ethics, there's no real way to confirm that anything really has value, anything really has inherent goodness, or I propose an ethical language that doesn't talk about value and goodness. I talk purely about reasons to do things or reasons to love things. And at the end of the day, because it's not empirical, even if those concepts make sense, I can never really get past the question of are there reasons to love anything for their own sakes or not? I can never make up my mind. But one of the functions of Christianity and maybe any divinely revealed religion in general is the claim that left to our own devices, we cannot figure out what to really think about the world. We can't really do science. We can't really do ethics. We can kind of come up with all these different possible systems and theories. But at the end of the day, we're left with merely maybe an infinitely proliferated set of hypotheses, we can never really make up our minds, and it kind of in some way paralyzes us. We could kind of maybe navigate the world pragmatically, but we'll never really know. And tying into what Augustine said about like I have faith so I can understand the world, or I believe so I can actually understand the world. The existence of God and the truth of the, let's say, Abrahamic moral paradigm is supposed to be an input into the process of human reasoning. So it's like, think of human reasoning in an individual mind, but also on a species level, as this complex series of processes that have all these different inputs and then they have outputs. You could think of it like reflective equilibrium. Without divine revelation in there, we really can't come to a definite conclusion about anything. But when you add divine revelation in, when you add scripture and then the tradition, and then maybe what's revealed privately through the Holy Spirit to people in some way, or miracles as signs of certain things, that gives human reasoning something more to work with, so that data might pop out a conclusion that actually is more definite. And so it might be that in terms of morality and ethics, at least pragmatically, it would be in our best interest to accept some sort of Christian moral paradigm, because that would, enable us to have confidence in these fundamental issues, like not be nihilists, or believe that there is some goal, or work out in ethics, things like that. And that's one possibility I raise. But in general, I think the society I would want to live in, the type of world I want to live in, even if I'm convinced of nihilism, I at this point will rebel against that. And the type of world I want to live in is a world dominated by the actual historical, like, Christian love ethic and the way of seeing the cosmos that the Christian tradition shows. It's super important, even on like a practical level for me.
Yeah. So I have a question, even about the way that you phrase that. Before I get to that question, I just want to say that Gloff threw into the chat, credo ut intelligam from Anselm, I believe, so that I may know. And I was actually going to say, my Latin is super rusty, so I was going to say, like, I believe through knowledge or something like that, because intelligam, am, that's the fourth declension of the noun in the, or that's the, I forget how Latin works, but that's like the direct object, like it ends in am, right? So anyway,
I'm really bad. I never took Latin except for in junior high, so I don't know.
Well, you're Orthodox, so that's fine.
Yeah,
but
so I took Greek in college, and I'm still extremely bad at it.
See, there you go. I never learned any Greek at all. But you said that there was this kind of pragmatic element to it, and I believe, so that I may know, sounds pragmatic to me. Like there's like this kind of pragmatic undertone to that saying. And I've got a question for you about the way that you phrase what you just said. You said, and I'm going to do my best to quote you word for word, you said something like you would prefer to live in a world that had been historically dominated by the Christian love ethic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That to me sounds not identical to I'd want to live in the world like exactly as how it has been. Right.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So, like, the world has been dominated by Christianity in a lot of respects. Like, Christianity is by far the dominant global religion, right? Like, there's 1 billion Catholics alone, right, in the world. That doesn't count all the non-Catholic Christians. So, Christianity dominated the world. Yep, great. But you didn't say, like, the ethic that has existed in the world that has been dominated by Christianity. You specifically said the Christian love ethic.
Yes.
I assume that means that those two things are not the same. And
They
so,
are not.
okay. And so how are they,
not.
how are they different?
I mean, okay. This is, okay, another one of Dave Bentley Hart's books that are really great is this weird little book called Tradition and Apocalypse that came out like 2 years ago. I completely agree with basically everything he says there. The idea is that Christian history, when you look at it, is a messy, oftentimes beautiful, oftentimes disgusting, mixed bag. That if that's what you mean by tradition, I can't read any single ethic off of it. I can't read any hope for the future eschatology off of it. It's just so messy and incoherent because a quarter of the time you have people being really great saints, 75% of the time you have a bunch of people being a-holes. Like, I'd have to separate that. But if you think of the tradition of Christian history in another way, as maybe there is something God is communicating to mankind, maybe there is something divinely revealed. And if you look at the core theology of Christianity, it's moral theology and it's metaphysical theology of like the divine, the dual natures of Christ, right? Divine and human, and what that really means. If you take that seriously and unpack that core, something follows from it that is incredibly beautiful and, in my perspective, completely positive. So that you're not saying that, like, I want Christendom to be back. Yay, let's have the Catholic Church run crusades and stuff again.
Monarchy and
yeah, monarchy is great, which I don't really have an opinion on. I don't really politics like I care about, but hey, that's a whole nother topic. But like, it's not that you're saying you want society to be organized in a certain way necessarily. Is you're saying, I wish that core, what seems, if anything's going to be divinely inspired, the current running through history that seems like it's actually from God, packed, like the Big Bang packed into a very tiny theology that then can explode outwards and expand and have all these weird implications. That's what I wish dominated. And and it really has never actually dominated the majority. No Christian has ever fully realized that. And that's trivial because we're all sinners, right? But no Christian institution has ever fully adopted what it really means to be Christian. So yeah, that's how it would be different.
Yeah, maybe I can ask like a specific. So, I will often hear people talk about, hey, it's part of like I am loving my fellow Catholic, right? When I correct them on their sin, right? So if I see somebody like Father James Martin, and Father James Martin is trying to preach like a more progressive, a more inclusive version of Catholicism, then I'm not loving Father James Martin unless I'm calling him to repent, right? And that comes across to me as not loving at all, right? I find that to be like really distasteful, right? That's probably not surprising, right? If you've seen my channel. I guess how do you determine what falls under this kind of like, perfected Christian love writ large, and then beyond you, like how do we all do that, I guess?
Yeah, so I think, and this is something shared by certain strains of Hinduism too, even though I'm not an expert on that, so I will not even talk about it, right? I'll let you see other people. Like, again, Dave Bentley Hart studied that stuff a lot, right? But just sticking to the Christian part of this, the Christian tradition, fundamentally, the fundamental doctrines of Christianity, such as the existence of a God who is perfect, creation out of nothing, logos theology, such that the second person of the Trinity is also, in some sense, the logos of the philosophical tradition, which kind of has different takes on it and stuff. But roughly the concept is either a divine intermediary or God himself working through divine wisdom or the divine mind and creating the world through that. And those doctrines fundamentally imply that God is not just a being that exists, but is being itself, is existence itself. Fundamental reality is God. He's the being of beings, as Aquinas would say. He's also, if you take a virtue ethics framework, which Christianity has always been wedded to, what it is for a person or for an action or thing to be good is to imitate God in whatever way that God has designed you to imitate him, right? According to your nature. It's natural law theory. The ultimate conclusion of these things is that every single thing that exists, down to every fundamental particle, is inherently valuable and good and worthy of love. In my terms, I'd say there's a reason to love everything that exists, because everything that exists is God. Not necessarily in a pantheistic way, but in a panentheistic way, where material existence itself is an energy of God, and an energy of something is not a separate object from it. It is it, right? It just doesn't exhaust its being. And so if you start to see the world as like the church fathers did, because this is unanimous throughout Christian history until like 200 years ago, every single thing that exists is good. There's no such thing as evil, in the sense that there's no being that is evil. Evil is just the destruction of life, the destruction of good beings, and they pass out of existence. If we were to really believe that, really to believe that not just every person, but every animal, every blade of grass, every bug, every atom, every fundamental particle was good and worthy of love, like that's a moral revolution within a person. And like if you really believe that, you'd watch where you step because you don't want to step on an ant, right?
Right.
If those parts of Christian theology, which what my book covers is like, these are non-negotiable parts of Christianity that we just don't remember because we hate metaphysics now, right? We hate theology now. If that dominated the world, that vision of reality, even if it was false, that's the type of world I would want to live in, where not only all men are brothers, but all men and women and all creatures are intimately related in this great chain of being, and are all connected in this one cosmic organism where a dysfunction in one part affects the status of the whole organism. And so we're all trying to preserve the being and life and functioning of each other. Like that's what Christianity at its essence teaches. That's what natural law theory is. That's what Christian virtue ethics is. But even in like Thomistic natural law theory, you do not find that among the practitioners of Thomism emphasized very much, right? You definitely do not see that play out through.
Sorry, I thought that was funny.
Say I'm a bad person yet I exist. Curious, said the Thomas. That's funny. That's good.
Yeah. So, I don't want to open up like a whole new big can of worms, but
I love worms. They're good.
They are. Good. We love worms here. I'm somebody who thinks that nothing ever ceases to exist. Right. So I guess as somebody who kind of holds this kind of mereological nihilism, right? And then I also just accept the whole, matter energy never ceases to exist, right? So it only changes forms. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, then nothing ever ceases to exist. So saying like that which exists is good, I don't know if that gets me very far, only because, well, everything exists and nothing doesn't exist. And nothing ever ceases to exist, and nothing new has ever begun to exist since it all started existing at the beginning of time.
Yeah.
So if all of those things that I just laid out are true, then kind of just like defining goodness as being almost just kind of like adds a second label to the same concept without actually kind of like adding any new expansionary power in a way. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Yeah. And that is like a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. But those are kind of like the things that kind of like occurred to me. But here's what I will say that is not a whole new can of worms, and it's that
I think there's a solution to that, by the way.
Okay.
Well, let's bypass that.
That's
for
fine.
Now and then
That's fine.
What were you gonna say? Yeah.
Cool. I don't think that I would have a YouTube channel if everybody shared that ethic, because in a large sense, my channel is like a reaction against kind of rad tradism, you know? And if every Christian had a very, if every Christian was Saint Francis of Assisi, right? Like not even stepping on any ants, then I don't think, I don't think I would have a channel. I don't think I'd have too much to complain about. So
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Like the problem with rad trats, the problem with fundamentalism, the problem with basically all of the type of stuff that you and I would want like to react to isn't that they haven't read the magisterial documents and the papal claims and understood them well. Like that's not the problem. The problem is that they don't love like they should. They have priorities that are out of order. And I mean, okay, frankly, how much of this stuff is American?
like
How
rad
much of it-
tradism,
Yeah,
I think it's like largely an American
it's
thing.
largely an American thing.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you though, I am so certain of this. Not literally because I don't believe in certain knowledge, but I think it's very probable that what's going on in these rad trad communities is that they are Americans first with American economic and liberal individualism first. And then anything that a bishop or Pope Francis says that runs up against their American conservatism, they automatically don't like, and so they start trying to find problems. You see this when Francis talks about refugees. You see this with climate change. And all of the stuff with bishops, like all of the stuff that these rad trats complain about are these very American culture war type issues. And I think all of that is fueled by anger and not love, not prioritizing the existence of beings, even like an ant, highly. Because I don't know how I could come up with like a right wing or conservative immigration stance if I believe that even an ant is so incredibly beautiful and valuable that I'm absolutely wrong for smashing it for fun.
Yeah.
Right? That I need to treat it with inherent dignity. So yeah, I don't think the rad trats have this vision of the world at all. I think it's been completely left behind. Because what this vision of the world entails is that every piece of wealth you have that you don't need to have a good life, you're stealing from another person. And you're doing something wrong. Like,
yeah,
that's traditional radical Christianity, man. It flows out of this cosmic moral consciousness.
it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. And certainly there are some trads who do act like that, but it is certainly not all.
Yeah.
Pierce, this has been an awesome conversation. We touched on a good amount, but not nearly all of the points that we even discussed over email. And I think, honestly, after this conversation, we could around double the points for conversations that we could have. So we'll have to keep, we'll have to have another conversation sometime soon.
Yeah, anytime.
But before we wrap up, I guess, do you have a rough timeline for when your book should be coming out? And is there anywhere in particular that like we can like reach you or anything like that? And what are you working on next, I guess?
My book should be out early 2024, so I'm thinking January through March is what the publisher said. The title will be A New Way of Seeing Meaning in Life and the Christian Vision of Nature. My website's probably the central place where you can find all my stuff. So it'd be www.pamarks.art. Not .com, .art.
And I'll put a link in the description.
Artsy. Yeah.
Cool.
And then, so that's, I just finished that project. And then the next thing that's coming out that's in peer review is an open access primer on the logic of inquiry.
Ooh.
Where everything we talked about today is laid out for high school level and like undergraduate level.
That's Kevin level.
Yeah. So if you want a copy, an advanced like manuscript of that and look at it, I'll give that to you. And if anyone wants it, you can have an advanced copy of it because it's going to be free anyway. It just has to be peer reviewed by several experts to be put on this site. So,
hey, I'd love to read it. Obviously, my review doesn't count as peer review but I would love to read it just for my own edification.
It actually does. Like, it will count as peer review because I'll give you details in an email. But like, okay. I would appreciate it if you wanted to read it. And give
I would love to. Yeah. I would love to.
Great.
Okay. Awesome. Piers, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll do it again soon.
Yeah.
And
thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah. No, my pleasure. And until next time.